Well, is that a very attacked word called patriotic?
Yeah, like that. Everyone hates patriots, or the media rather, just always hates patriots. Like,
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the book, right? It's like,
Didn't
so the
mention
media are undermining the nation. Thank you. Yeah, it's like the media are undermining the nation. I think is a big part of why people aren't reading as well is because the constant torrent of bad news and scary, and it always seems like something real seriously bad is about to happen, right? It's like just like you're saying, it's like a 3-week cycle or something like that, where it's like there's always like a new thing that.
Yeah, but people have an interest in something for 3 weeks and then they've lost interest. So every 3 weeks they come up with a new disaster to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that can really put people off having children as well, because you're just like, yeah, it's a lot to worry about, you know. And I've heard people say that like having children is like the bravest thing you can do, and I agree, because it's just to bring a new life into this world and let them be, you know, raise them and let them be. It's a scary thing to do, and the things you have to worry about and face. Like people who haven't had kids, you know, they haven't gone through. There's so much they haven't gone through, like consideration what it is to like raise a child and to like look out for their safety in the world. It really changes you. Yeah.
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 Yeah. The other thing the Jesuits do is they run the Catholic Inquisition, right? And the Catholic Inquisition runs the family courts, or what do you call it here?
I think it's the family courts, isn't it?
Is it the family courts? Yeah.
That's familiar, yeah.
The Catholic Inquisition runs the family courts, so their speciality is stealing children of parents who think.
Oh, I don't like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually I won custody and raised my child, and as soon as I won custody, I was 6 years in court, and there was no issues. There was no property to divide up. There was just no domestic violence, no psychological violence, nothing. And they'd written down on a piece of paper that there had been no psychological violence, no domestic violence, and there was no material possessions to fight over, right? So I handed that into the court, and they lost it. And then I lost the main bit of evidence. And instead of something being over in 2 weeks, they were at it for 6 years, hounding me, and then trying to create crimes. They police follow me, police bust into my house, getting sprayed with poison, charging me with dangerous driving, and then changing the road markings so that where you could overtook, they changed the road markings so you couldn't overtake. Right?
In order to try and pin it on you for overtaking it. Oh,
yeah. Now, the person who was the counsel for the child, which is essentially another lawyer against the father, he was actually the head of the Catholic Inquisition in New Zealand. His name is Paul Gagan, right? And he was working with this lawyer who I knew as a teenager, and he was a alcoholic, coke user, and incestuous pedophile, which I had exposed in my books. So I was up against the Catholic Inquisition and a pedophile cover-up for 6 years, and I won, right? I won, and everyone's going, you know, everyone was completely surprised that I won, but I just kept on hounding with the evidence and saying, no, they're just making stuff up. And then 2 weeks later, the lawyer, Paul Gagan, who's the head of the Catholic Inquisition in New Zealand, he nominated himself as a judge. Right? You can't nominate yourself as a judge. But the Attorney General was a KGB gangbang prostitute during the Cold War in St. Petersburg. She only had one leg, but some people like that stuff, right? So she changed the laws for 2 weeks so that the head of the Catholic Inquisition could nominate himself as a judge after he spent 6 years attacking me and losing. Right, so you've got legalism as well. You've got judicialism as well, which is also run by the Jesuits and the Catholic Church. And it's all designed to harm thinkers. They don't want people who can see through the bullshit. Then what happened is Paul Gagan went on the Charlie Ward show, who's a twice convicted fraudster. Charlie Ward's convicted for counterfeiting money, falsifying IDs, identity theft, and abandoning his own family, which he's jailed for 6 months.
Wow.
So he's for 6 months twice, plus he's a big coke user, coke dealer. So Charlie Ward starts his show and he's promoted because he's a criminal. right? It's criminal. And then Paul Gagan, the head of the Catholic Inquisition, goes on to the Charlie Ward show and talks about me and says that I didn't win custody. Whereas I did win custody and I raised my child. Right? So even after I've gone through 6 years of being grilled through protection orders and stuff, and I won, they're still trying to defame my reputation because I'm still a thinker.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So the Jesuits don't stop hounding you until they hand over the Roman Empire to you.
So,
I mean, you've actually got to take back the entire Roman Empire and the entire Holy Roman Empire and the Holy See and every Catholic Church and every title of the Pope, including Vicar of Christ, in order to get liberation from their taunting. If that ingrained in falsifying and projecting harm onto people who can think, especially when they're in stressful situations and they can still think.
and this is due to essentially the depth of corruption going on at the core of the church is, yeah, so ugly that they're constantly looking for anyone as a potential threat, which basically anyone who can think and loves their country and wants to know what's going on. Yeah. So, I mean, can you talk about like within like this country, like say like in Scotland, for example? So I remember one of the things you'd said was that United, when they use the word United or Union,
okay,
name, it's usually a Catholic corporation. And I discovered that my local football team, Dundee United, was started by Catholic priests. And I say I've been going since I was a boy. Well, my dad goes, and I used to go when I was a boy and stuff. And we actually never knew that. But of course, I knew that Celtic was a Catholic team and Rangers was a Protestant, and Hearts and Hibs in Edinburgh. But in Dundee, I actually never knew, and no one I talked to even knew that they were actually started by Catholic and Protestants. It's like because the sectarianism isn't that strong in Dundee. I don't really hear of a lot of fighting between Catholics and Protestants, but you hear about it a lot in Glasgow. It's like a big, it's still a big tribal thing there,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So, we're best known as the United States of America and the United Kingdom, right? Whenever you hear the word united, it means Jesuit overlay, right? So Sir Walter Raleigh, my ancestor, he was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II to discover North America. And she actually gave him North America in 1584, 1586, and 1591, right? And then the Jesuits came along under the form of Benjamin Franklin, who was working for the French, and he's working for the English, and he's working for the Catholics, and he's working for the Jesuits, to create the United States of America from about, he started early, but it was 1767 to 1959, by the time they got the 50 states, right? And so the whole United States of America is a Jesuit overlay over North America. So what you've got is this voting system where you vote for a president of the United States of America, which is the president of the Jesuit United States of America. And there is no elections for North America, right? So what they need to do is have elections for the president of North America.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people say, what are you? I say, I'm an American, I'm a North American. They don't say I'm a United Statesian.
United States, yeah.
And it's the same for the UK. So we had England until 1603. And since then, we've had an English soccer team and the courts of England and Wales, and nothing else about this place is English or England, right? So in 1603, when we got the commoner, Jesuit servant, fraudster, King James VI of Scotland, right, who was never actually crowned King James VI of Scotland, nor King of Scots. Queen Elizabeth died. She was poisoned for 2 years. And then James VI of Scotland, who was never crowned, who was a commoner, took a very long time to come down to England. And then he said that he was the King of England. but he didn't. He said he was the king of Britain, Brittain, or the king of Brittany, Britanne, right? And then Sir Francis Bacon pointed out that Britain and Brittany were not legal terms, and he was king of nothing, and that this is the fake Stuart lineage. So you got James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II. They're all the Stuart lineage, and they were all king of Brittany, or king of Britain, which was not Britain, and it was not England. Became the king of, or queen of, Great Britain in 1707. So we actually had no legal monarchs of England or Britain or Great Britain from 1603 to 1707.
And what about Scotland? I guess that the same. Yeah, there would be no Scottish monarch at that time as well.
Yeah, you had no
monarch
from 1566, 67. Because what happened was Mary Queen of Scots gave birth to a child who was either called James Charles or Charles James. No one knows, right? No one knows. And he actually died at 2.5 days old. And what happened is they had the cannons going off in Edinburgh Castle celebrating his birth. And the maternity ward was directly below the cannons. And the shockwaves from the cannons caused the baby to die. The shockwaves and noise. So they broke a bit of the wall and shoved the baby in, right? And then dropped it over the wall again and said IAMES, Ames, James, buried, right? And then they got the wet nurse had given birth on the same day, called John Forbes. So they used John Forbes as James VI to carry out the illusion. And then they took John Forbes to Stirling Castle to the first Earl of Mar, John Erskine. And he had a child who might have actually been 6 years old or 8 years old instead of 13 months old. And they got rid of John Forbes and they used the John Erskine, the second Earl of Mar, as James VI, who's supposed to be 13 months old, and they crowned him in Stirling Castle as King of Scots, King James VI of Scotland. And then he became the British ambassador, or the ambassador, Scottish ambassador to London. He went down and saw Sir Walter Raleigh, who was actually the true King of England, and in 1601, and told John Erskine, second Earl of Mar, told Sir Walter Raleigh what had gone on, and then he was the true King of Scots, and Sir Walter Raleigh was the true King of England. So then, and at the same time that this happened, the Scottish aristocracy absolutely knew James Charles or Charles James had died, and that it was another baby that was christened and another baby that got the crown. And so they all went on a breeding race and tried to produce a child called James. So they had all these fake James VI babies all around Scottish palaces, all around the Firth of Forth. And sometimes they played together. And then they were all taken to Ruthven Castle, but it's just a 3-story ramshackle stone building. And they were all kidnapped. It's called the Ruthven Raid. And they were taken to Slains Castle and taken care of by a Jesuit servant who was the same age. And he studied them all and then poisoned them all. And then went down to St Andrews University, where you were. Then he went across to St Catherine's Abbey, which had just been ruined 24 years earlier. And the highest religious figure, he was in prison in St Andrews bottleneck prison, the bottle in St Andrews Castle. So he couldn't say that's not Charles James or James Charles or King of Scotland. So a whole bunch of Jesuits sailed over from Europe as arranged, and then pointed to this Jesuit servant who had just killed King James VI, and pointed to him and said, "That's the missing king, that's the kidnapped king." So that's how the Jesuit servant became King James VI. A whole bunch of Jesuit tourists pointing to him, saying, you're King James VI of Scotland, you're the missing king. And he goes, thanks. And then he gets into poetry and he writes poems on how he killed all the other King James VI. And any historian can read these poems and say, that's an admission of murder, of double murder, right? And it's even called Slains Castle, right?
Slains Castle.
They slain the king, Slains Castle. And then James VI used Slains Castle as a tourist destination for Catholics and Jesuits to go to celebrate the murder of the James VI. And then he borrows money and blows up Slains Castle so no one can see the evidence or find any DNA or whatever. And that becomes Guy Fawkes. It was done in it was actually done on the 1st of November, but it's close enough to the 5th. And then a few years later, he did Guy Fawkes and they tried to blame it on Sir Walter Raleigh, but oops, Sir Walter Raleigh was already in the Tower of London.
Wow.
And then King James VI, the fake one, the first thing he did when he came to England was put Sir Walter Raleigh in prison in the Tower of London, and then 6 days later had his coronation because he knew that Sir Walter Raleigh was the true King of England. Not only that, Sir Walter Raleigh is the owner of North America, which is passed down to me. Hello, North America. Bye-bye, United States of America.